Welcome to Elevating la Cultura podcast, a space where I talk with Latinas who are passionate about what they do and are willing to share that passion with others to change the narrative, especially for the next generation. Each season is centered around different topics, but all with a Latina perspective. Welcome to Season 7. I'm so excited to share these stories and hope they will offer encouragement, wisdom, and be something that you can relate to. So vámonos, and let's get into it. Hey, so happy to have Jessica, a fellow podcaster on Elevating la Cultura today. Jessica Cuevas is the creator of Viva la Mami, a platform that was created after not finding stories of Latina women's experiences about motherhood. There is a lack of representation in this space, and she felt there was a need for mamis to share their stories and to learn more about the nuances about motherhood as bicultural and bilingual mujeres. Viva la Mami is on a mission to redefine the meaning of motherhood by hearing from other Latina moms, learning from expert advice, and more. Jessica believes that Latina mothers should celebrate their accomplishments and failures through this overwhelming, fun, tiring, and wonderful journey in motherhood. Viva la Mami is a blog, podcast, and community made by and for the Latina mom. Enjoy our conversation. Hi, I am here today with Jessica. I'm so excited to have her on the podcast. And I was recently on her podcast. And so now the mics have flipped and I get to interview and chat with her today. We met, it was last year, so maybe like 6 months ago. And I think I was following you beforehand because we have a mutual friend, Vanessa Avalos. Shout out to her. She is a guest on season 3 of the podcast, but we met in person through an event that Vanessa and I co-hosted. And from the first time meeting, I just loved your energy and especially your interaction with your family. I thought it was really beautiful, and I was I went up to you and I was like, we need to collaborate, we need to get together, we need to keep chatting, and so I'm so glad that you are on the podcast today. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Karina, so much for inviting me. This is actually my first interview, so kind of on the other side as someone interviewing for a podcast. And let me tell you that I love your podcast. It's funny because I did some search and for some reason SEO brought me to your podcast and I was like, "Wait, I think I know the name. I think I know who she is." And yeah, through that search, I found your podcast without even me knowing that you had created one, and I've been listening to yours ever since. I think this was in the middle of the pandemic too. So but yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. So my name is Jessica Cuevas, and I am the creator of Viva la Mami. So it is essentially a platform for Latina moms by a Latina mom. So I do identify as first and a half, first generation, born in the US. And through my experience, I noticed that there is just a lack of representation among different systems, among different aspects in our day-to-day lives. This can be anywhere from college, because I'm a first generation college graduate, to now motherhood. And so because of that lack of representation, especially in that pivotal moment of my pregnancy and in my very first stages of my postpartum journey, I just didn't see myself in any of the platforms that I was following, in any of the social media accounts that I was following, no blogger. I was like, what is going on? And because of that, I created Viva la Mami. So Viva la Mami is essentially a space for Latina moms where I get to provide evidence-based information from experts. So I also have a podcast where I do interview some experts in a variety of fields, ranging from education to mental health, I am soon interviewing someone within the medical field. And so that way it can kind of validate and empower Latina moms about their journeys is in their motherhood journey. I also interview moms, just regular moms like yourself and I, just to kind of share their stories about their motherhood journeys. And I usually call it madrehood because that's just part of our identity as Latina moms. And that has been very empowering for me just to listen and hear all of their stories because oftentimes in our culture, we were brought up as women to not talk, right? Like we didn't have a voice at the table. Calladita te ves más bonita. That kind of like cultural aspect has been very like ingrained in us where we don't really talk about our feelings. We don't talk about just like our the struggles of being a woman, but also being a mom at the same time. And so within, these women sharing their stories, I think that it is very powerful to kind of help them elevate, their experiences and also validate those experiences as well. And so right now, Viva la Mami is a podcast, but it's also a platform via social media. And I do have a website as well where I share a couple of blog posts. But yeah, kind of in a nutshell, it's again for Latina moms by Latina moms.
That is beautiful and a space that I wish I had years ago when I was just a new mom. So I am excited for all of the moms that are a part of what you're building and also the ones that get to listen, learn, and grow. I I'm curious about how you introduced yourself as first and a half gen. And the reason I'm curious is because sometimes that's how I also introduce myself, first ish, second ish. Um, so I'm curious what that means to you.
Yeah. So for me, it means that, well, first of all, my parents were born in Mexico. So, they were naturally born there. But my mom, she and her family immigrated when she was 8 years old. And so she did like the full, elementary to high school, education experience in the US. She was actually top 10 in her class and she was ready to go to college, but unfortunately she was undocumented. And at that time in the late 80s, they didn't have the resources and she didn't really know how to navigate the college system being undocumented. So unfortunately, she didn't pursue that. My dad came here at 14. So really the bulk of their lives have been in the United States. And even though I was born here and my sisters were born here in the US, we have such a strong connection to our roots. And that's something that I'm very proud of that my parents never kind of neglected where they came from, even though they came to the US at such a young age. And so, even though we had this sense of duality, I guess, between, our identity as Mexican Americans, literally, I still consider myself, kind of like that first generation. And if first generation, first and a half ish generation like yourself. And I think it's because I still speak the language, I do identify as Mexican, pero también I identify as American. So I'm kind of in this duality, right? Like I'm living in this both world kind of thing, which has been challenging in itself. I mean, it is beautiful because I consider myself bicultural and bilingual. I love it, but it's also hard to navigate a society that isn't friendly for bilingual, bicultural folks, right? It's either one way or the other. And even when you go to Mexico too, it's like, well, it is gringa, or, I remember they used to call us las Barbies. What does that mean? And so that in itself being in this kind of half generation kind of like identity that I have, like it's beautiful, but it's also challenging.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm also in that same like my mentality when it comes to how I identify, because my mother was born in the US. Her parents were born in Texas. Her father was born just across the border. And my father immigrated here when he was in his late teens. And so for my father's side, like he was a lot of changing he did a lot of changing the trajectory for his family roots. My mother, being born here, identified as American, but also was tied to her culture. And so then there's me, who was born and has a father that is like, well, eres mexicana, and we're going to be part of the parades in Chicago, and we're going to go to Mexico every year, so you know your family. And then my mother, who grew up in the 70s and 80s and really had this like identity uh, where she had to fit into a certain space and wasn't allowed to maybe live. I don't want to speak on her behalf, but from what I understand, like she taught me like, oh well, this is the American culture, like don't speak Spanish when we have guests, because you don't want to make them uncomfortable. Don't speak Spanish in Mexico porque no sabes bien. And I'm just like, ugh, I don't know what to do, because my first language was Spanish, and so I have that knowledge and that understanding to understand what is being said to me. But it's like I get tripped up sometimes and I'm not as quick when I want to speak Spanish. So that's how I say, like, oh, that's why I say I'm 1.5, because I feel like I'm the first to like go to college, have a higher education from my father's side. Um, but I'm also like second gen on my mother's side, if that makes sense. And I think like there has been so much weight placed on labels, and it can be so stressful, because when you might identify as like, oh, I'm first gen, but then someone is like, well, what does that mean to you? And what does that? And I'm just like, can't we just like accept who we are and just like live into our Latinidad as we like, based on our own lived experiences? How are you now with this space, and with you leaning more into being vocal about motherhood and what it means to you as a Latina mom? How have you um, kind of gone through that journey? Like, I'd love to know the story of where that started, where that desire started from, and how it's grown to what Viva la Mami is now.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. For me, I kind of going back pre motherhood, I got my master's in higher education from Loyola University Chicago. So I come from a higher education background, specifically admissions. And I thought that my master's program was going to be just about how to work with students, but in reality it was such an impactful program because it really taught me about understanding my identity as a person of color and how I can sort of contribute and advocate for students who come from marginalized backgrounds. So that was the first time when I really learned about privilege, oppression, social justice. And I know that these are like top buzzwords, especially right now in this current world that we live in. But I think it was very impactful for me because this was an opportunity for me to really delve into literature and research and really understanding who I am in this world and how to go about, living through my lived experiences and how I can not only advocate for the people that I work for or that I, help and support, but also for myself as well. And so coming from that lens, when we found out that we were pregnant, um, I was like, trying to search for YouTubers. I was literally on YouTube. I searched Latina mom, and literally all what I saw was images of like mamas con la chancla, right? That chancla culture. Um, Guys dressed up in like their moms and just saying like, oh, things that Latina moms say, or, be careful, the Latina mom is coming. And it's all of like the negative, stereotypical images of perhaps what people think of a Latina mom. And so I was like, okay, YouTube, like what is going on? And so then I, went on Google and I was searching Latina mom bloggers and things like that. And all of this was more so about like lifestyle, fashion, nothing that came organically or authentically about a mother of a Latina mother's like perspective. And so I was like, there is just this lack of representation. And when I searched just motherhood, then all in the search results from Google and even YouTube, they were just images of white women. And, again, coming from this like social justice mindset, from my background, my educational background, I'm like, okay, well, this is great information, but there is no relevancy about my lived experiences. And I've always battled with my identity as Latina, right? Because again, in speaking about duality and being bicultural, bilingual, living in this two kind of sided world, I've always struggled with like trying to find myself and really trying to find my true like authentic purpose in anything, whether it be in my career choice, whether it be in now motherhood, right? And so I wanted to ensure that I was making good decisions and that I was getting information that was relevant to me as a Latina. And yeah, so I couldn't find anything. And yes, there's a couple, bloggers, there's a couple, like social media people, but there really wasn't a podcast. And, I could think of a couple podcasts, but it's mostly about, um, just day to day life, but really not about mothers sharing their experiences and stories. Because oftentimes when we hear stories from other moms or even other people, like, again, it validates your experience and knowing that you're not alone. And being that you already feel in isolation as a mom, um, even in pregnancy, right? Oftentimes we don't know where to seek answers. We don't know who to look up to. Even in our own families, sometimes you get like unsolicited advice or old school mentality kind of opinions. And it's like, well, where do I belong? And so oftentimes it kind of leads you into this level of isolation where you don't know who to count on or, what to look for. And so that is one of the reasons why I created, Viva la Mami, just so that it can be a centralized location for Latina moms or even future Latina moms to really count on, this information and the wealth of, like the stories that are being presented by all of these other Latina moms. And as we know, us in the Latinx community, um, we're not all the same. We are all different. Our backgrounds are different. Our language is even different. Our lived experiences are different. And so I do want to validate that as well, that knowing that not all Latina moms are going to come out with la chancla, right? I just want to literally, I wish that there was just like a magic wand where that kind of stereotypical image of a Latina can be just like taken off, because unfortunately that has disallowed people like us who are trying to make a difference, who are trying to validate people's experiences. It's not allowing us to kind of create this kind of platform that we want to create, because unfortunately there are still people that are giving this false narrative about us. And so yeah, so I think it's time to change that, and that's why I'm here.
Yeah, going back to your Google search and searching Latina motherhood or Latina mom, and I think all of us who are listening, at least for me, and maybe our listeners can also relate. Like, I could see exactly the type of mom that you that was coming up in the Google search, the stereotypical, like with the apron and the chancla. Yep. And I think that, like, that stereotype has only been perpetuated because people see it as funny, and they don't they see it as funny because we've been conditioned to believe that it's funny. And now as adults, they're like, oh, haha, that was funny, when it was really traumatic. And I think that when we first start in our motherhood journey, at least for me, because I had my first at in 2011. And so that was right around when Instagram started, right around when Pinterest started. I was building my photography career, and all of this stuff was booming. And like, the searches were all from the white perspective. Like, I did not have any influential people that I could look to as far as motherhood goes that were Latinas. And I only knew what my parents were telling me was right. And they're like, well, it worked for you. So, and I was like, it did work for me. And it wasn't until like I was starting to unpack the what I was feeling, and how I didn't want to continue the same discipline style, or continue the same uh, narrative for my kids as far as the relationship that I have with them. Like, it was only then, I think only until I had my son, that I was like, the things that I was made to believe, like, are wild, and I don't want to perpetuate that way of thinking. Because a lot of so I have a sister, and my son was the first boy, like, in our family. And so there are a lot of thoughts about boys in as in a Latina family. There are a lot of ideas about females and what those roles should be. And so as soon as I saw that coming out, when I had my son, I was like, no, I have to do something, and I don't know what. Um, and so, was there a moment in your life, be like, even as you had your first, that you were like, this is what needs to change? And did you have that conversation with your family as well? And how did that go?
Yeah, so for me, it started out in pregnancy, because it's interesting. When I was kind of in my second to third trimester, I started to get a lot of questions about, oh, are you planning to have an epidural? Are you planning to, you know, get induced? And again, in our society, culturally, in the United States, people do plan their pregnant, like their birth. They plan their labor, when they want their child to be born. And I found that kind of interesting. And I'm like, why are people asking me these questions? I'm only like, I have like 20 weeks left or something like that. And I then started to do some research, because also I got pregnant in the middle of the pandemic. I had nowhere else to go. I was just home, which was kind of nice because yeah, people didn't get to see me, and I'm kind of weird about people seeing my belly and everything. But yeah, so I was like, you know, why are you planning, why should women plan like their labor or their childbirth? And so, you know, as I delved a little bit deeper, I learned about doulas, and just like having, you know, natural birth, unmedicated births. And that kind of intrigued me because I knew that my grandma had 5 daughters and she did it all natural. My mom as well, you know, she had 3 unmedicated births. And I was like, well, what did, like, what happened? Like, why is there a very big shift between our last generation and this current generation? And I knew that my sister, she had 2 children before me, and you know, she was induced because she had to be induced. And I was like, well, why? And so after doing some research, you know, it's because that's how the United States medical system is. And I was like, well, there should be alternative ways. And then that's when I found out about, you know, getting support by a doula, going to a midwife, you know, just being more intentional about your birth, and that women have their own rights and voice about making, kind of creating their childbirth plan, even though, as we know, childbirth is all dependent on the baby and your body. We cannot control that. But at least I wanted to have some sort of say in this. And it wasn't really until, I think it was your podcast, that brought me to Isabel Gonzalez Smith. Now that I think about it, but I remember you had interviewed her, and I was like, I want to know more about this doula. And yeah, like I utilized her. It was all virtual because of the pandemic, unfortunately, so she wasn't with us during that time. But really, it wasn't until pregnancy that I learned more about the traditional methods in childbirth, and how that kind of transcends into postpartum and recovery, and all of this stuff, like anywhere by utilizing el rebozo, or you know, these natural herbs. Like, I did not know. And it's interesting because I still have my grandma with us, like my great grandma is here, and I'm like, por qué no nos dicen eso? You know, why is it that you're not telling us this? And again, I think it's because of, you know, assimilation. Like, they had to assimilate, and they didn't share these stories, especially when it came to childbirth and the postpartum recovery. But this was something that came out of curiosity, kind of out of wanting to know why there was a sudden shift from traditional medicine to like now this Americanized medicine. And because of that, that really inspired me to make a shift as well. And really, it wasn't until this part of the beginning part of my motherhood journey, where I felt more connected to my own culture. I felt more inspired by it. And I'm like, I need to say something about this. And so that's how really Viva la Mami started as well. Like, I'm like, I'm here to share what I went through. And through that, you know, it kind of grew out of like getting more um getting more like stories about different women and their lived experiences, because again, my story isn't just the only one that will only resonate, you know, to the Latina mom. It we do need to factor in all of these different stories, so that way someone can be connected in some capacity.
I think it's so amazing that the more we share and elevate the stories, that we are brought together and then encouraged to keep changing and keep shifting things. Um, so I am so grateful that there are more people sharing their stories. And I am so grateful to Isa for the community that she's building. She was on the podcast. She was one of my first guests, and I met her through Chicago Latina Moms. And I went to a Chicago Latina Mom event because I wanted to be in community with other Latina moms, and I did not have that at all where I was living. I really didn't have like a Latina community growing up, and I'm realizing how much I needed that and how much it has really propelled me in my own growth, and therefore been able to be continued through my kids. I think of the comment that you made about how um, like we are in between two generations, and I talk about this all the time because I truly feel like I am like clinging to both generations, but also trying to change things, which is so hard because we still get the comments from our parents and beyond of how we're not doing things right, or like, how are you going to do that? Or um, even with me choosing to homeschool my kids, the first years that I started homeschooling my kids, my father would come and start quizzing them. He would be like, "What's this? And what's one plus one? And how do you say this?" And they were just like, okay. They would answer him, and I'd be like, "What are you doing? Like, why are you like, why can't you just accept that this is how things are going to be?" But I think that there's also this sense of, well, did I not do good enough from our parents? Because they want to see, they hear that we want to change things and we want to do things differently. And so there's this mentality of like, oh, well, maybe I didn't do good enough. And that's why they don't want to do the same thing that I did. Um, do you experience that in your own family? And then how do you move forward from that? I think that's an experience that a lot of Latina parents experience, and I'm interested to know from you.
Yes. Yes, I feel that now that I have such a public kind of platform, and through the podcast, I definitely share a lot about my childhood and upbringing and kind of like how I was raised. And my mom, like, she loves, everything that I do. Like, she hearts everything that I do, which I love. But I'm part of me, I'm like, oh my gosh, ojalá que like she didn't hear, kind of like the side comments or like the things that I say or share. And I told her, I was like, don't take this personal, but the same way as how she learned how to parent because of the way that she was parented by my grandparents, she obviously wanted to change. She, my mom told me that my grandma has never really told her that she loves her. And it wasn't until her 50th birthday that my grandma told her that she loved her. And the fact that it took my grandma 50 years of her life to say that, for my mom, it's like, I'm going to tell my daughters every day that I love them. And so it's kind of like that same concept, right? Like yes, even though we are byproducts of our past generations and ancestors, our inner child tells us, well, what is it that you needed? Whether if it was from when you grew up or even till now, what is it that you still need, that you want change for the next generation, for your children? And so, yeah, so some of the things that I've changed, for example, and this can be the little things, you talked about your homeschooling. For us, it was baby led weaning. So we didn't feed our firstborn D, our first child. We didn't feed him pureed like foods. My parents were like, "¿Qué?" le vas a dar I don't know, like una manzana entera. And I'm like, no, no es una manzana entera. It's just like a short little like strip of like sliced apple. But they freaked out and they were like, but he's going to choke. Like he's basically going to like die, and just giving me all of these negative perceptions instead of accepting the fact that, well, we did the research. My husband and I both agreed that this is the way that we're going to feed him. And the reason why, it's because it's different textures, you know, like it's very helpful for a developing child to experience different textures. And apparently they don't end up being picky, but yeah, no, he's now 2 and he's extremely picky, so I don't think that the research I think there needs to be more research about that. But yeah, like even like little things like that where I still go through that battle of like being judged because I'm doing things differently or the other way. Sometimes, and this really happened ever since I went to college, right? Like I'm known as like the perfectionist. I'm known as like, you know, the la güera or whatever. Like, oh, my little cousins, all of my cousins have told me, "Oh, miss, I went to college." Like, woo woo. And I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, I did go to college and it did change me. It changed my trajectory of my life, but I am very cognizant and aware that you know, whatever decisions I make is because that there is intentionality behind it, and especially when raising a kid. And so yeah, like I'm pretty sure that my mom, specifically my mom, my dad, I don't think he cares, but like my mom, I think I don't want to purposely shame her, because as we know as women, we always feel shamed. Like even now, they're in Mexico. They've been there since December. It is March right now, and she feels very like guilty leaving us even though we're adults. Like she literally told us that. And I'm like, well, you made this decision. It's fine. Like we'll be fine. And so, yeah, like I'm sure that she still feels like some level of guilt or shame because of the way she parented. But I would have to say that through her parenting and whatever generation that comes next, we improve, right? We kind of tend to gather the things that we learned from and experience, and how can we make it better for, again, the next generation. So yeah, like that's a really good question.
I think it's funny. I'm funny as in like not funny. But how we will go down this path that we have been told is the right path, and then we get made fun of for
Hmm.
it.
Yes.
Or we have to endure the sarcasm or the ridicule of, oh, well, you went to college and now you think this, and
Hmm.
now, oh, you're homeschooling, or, it's, ugh. I think that is uh, a trait that needs to go. I have been loving our conversation because I have not like followed the questions at all, and I've just been asking based on what you have said. And I think I love that because, as you can see, like we don't talk about our experiences as parents enough. I think of um, even going back to this idea of what Latina motherhood used to be or is, and I think of the mothers that the Latina mothers that I have in my life now, and I'm like, that is nothing like what is portrayed in comedy or in the media or in just Google searches. And I think back to like my kids not ever having to know that. And I think a lot of the internal and mental struggles that our parents went through and that we are healing from now is due to colonialism and what they experienced from previous generations. I think we're still seeing the effects of colonialism and that sense of control that you need to control your kids. And I think that is the biggest shift that our generation is making when it comes to parenting, because they can't like understand how to have a relationship with someone who is younger that isn't based on control.
Right.
Because when I um, think about how I was grappling with how to discipline my children, because I only knew one thing. And that was like chancla culture. Like I
Mm-hmm.
only knew that it was up to me and it was my fault if I looked like I was failing at motherhood
Yeah.
because my kids were whatever, doing something they weren't supposed to, maybe speaking disrespectfully, which is really just speaking curiously at
Mm-hmm.
that age. And I think that is the mentality that a lot of us adults now that were born like as millennials are really having to shift. And it is a hard mindset
Yes.
to shift. And so I am curious as to how you have been able to do that in partnership with your spouse
Mm-hmm.
in choosing to do things differently. Because if you are in a two-parent home, like it is definitely needing to be addressed and talked about between both parents. And so, do you have any advice on how you can have that conversation for new moms, or even like if you find yourself already in motherhood and realizing that you want things to be different and are starting your healing journey, how do you change completely? Like, how do
Yes.
you start that conversation?
Whew. Yes. That is a really good question because I think it affects really the trajectory of your parenting and it affects your children, right? And so for Alex, my husband, and I, we definitely talked about, okay, how do you want to raise your child? Like if I wasn't around, how would you raise them? And so yeah, so we talked about that. And granted, we had that opportunity to talk about it because we did plan, our pregnancy. We planned, when we wanted to have kids. I know that many families don't get to do that, but for us, we definitely talked about, how do we want to raise our children. For my husband, he is still battling and struggling with his upbringing because he had a father. His father's still around, but his father would yell at him all the time. Like he never had a voice. My husband, like he never had the opportunity to express himself. His mom would just grab anything, almost if she finds a weapon, she'll hit him. And for him, everything was very traumatized, and he is still going through that healing process. For me, I grew up with my mom just yelling at my dad and screaming at him. And screaming at us. My dad would, would he wouldn't hit us, but he would threaten us to hit us, right? And I get it. It's just like how you said, right? We are byproducts of colonialism, and unfortunately that's how uh, our parents grew up and their parents grew up, because of this um because like colonizers essentially hit anyone and everyone for whatever reason, and that is still pretty much the expectation. In fact, when we told our family that we were expecting our first, the first question that we got from my mother-in-law was, "Van a pegar al niño?" And I'm like, "What? Like, is that like the only expectation?" Like, and so it really took us aback, and we're like, "What? Like, is that the expectation as parents, as Latino parents? Like, if we're gonna hit our kids?" And so so yeah, there was a lot of unpacking, a lot of, conversation between my husband and I. Um, and essentially, we had to come into an agreement, and we obviously both agreed that we will never raise our hands to our children. And there's different ways of parenting. And that's something that our parents probably still don't know, that there are different ways, like different parenting styles, right? And that is when we need to lean in to evidence-based information, right? The research. And it is very difficult, though, to see this because all what you see is just Anglo-Saxon families, right? They're the ones that are doing the heavy work in, you know, sharing this information, yes, but again, like, how do you navigate these two worlds that we're a part of? You know, how do we also educate now the grandparents that no, this is the way that we're parenting and this is what you should respect, you know, our decision. And so I think it comes with, I would say, three different things, right? Like having the talk with your partner about how you want to parent. The second one is therapy. I've been going to therapy ever since my son D was, I would say, 10 months old, because I thought I had it all covered the first 10 months, but clearly I didn't. And through therapy, I started to recognize, okay, well, there's different methods, there's different, like, awesome resources that not only is, you know, intentional for, you know, like white families, but it's BIPOC friendly. And so through that, like, I started to learn more about, you know, how to approach different behaviors or different ways before it escalates to that point where then I end up, you know, parenting the way that I was parented. And then the third one is education. I really think that that is the key to educating the grandparents, the caregivers, um, the past generation, and even the future generation that, you know, we, if we want to be intentional of the way that we want to parent, we need to break some cycles. We have to understand that this is not our fault. You know, the way that we were parented is out of survival, literally, because oftentimes many families grew up um, in, you know, in poverty, and out of survival or out of frustration, that made an impact with the way that they parented, right? So recognizing that there are systems set in place for all of us, unfortunately, that impacts the way that we parent. And so it's kind of creating that awareness and that education about, you know, that there are different methods and different ways in parenting. So those are the three things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I'm also a huge advocate for therapy
Yes.
because whenever you're doing the hard work of healing and unpacking, like it's wild, and it's always a good idea to do it with someone who can actually help you uh, through that because like I said, I grew up with this mentality that I turned out fine and I don't need help and I'll just do everything the way that I was taught because it worked for me. And I think that is the first lie that you have to kind of unpack.
Mm-hmm.
And once you pull on that thread, like then everything starts unraveling and revealing itself. Um, so thank you for sharing that. Um, what advice would you give for the next generation of mamas?
Yes. One piece of advice that I can give to the next generation of mamas is that living your most authentic self is going to help you be the best parent that you can be. I think that in this current generation, we're often influenced by social media. And as we know, social media can be fake in a way because you're only seeing one part of a person's life. And that makes you question whether if you are a good mom or not, right? It makes you question whether you're doing a good job or not. But I think for the next generation, I know probably social media will never go away, and who knows what other aspect of social media will come in the future. But I think that um, whatever decisions you make, and with intentionality, though, I think that you will be a great parent. Um, and I also think that it is very important to share your story, to voice out, your lived experiences, because in any way or capacity that when you do have that opportunity to compartir and build community, it just will make a difference for someone else who perhaps didn't have the opportunity to share, their story. So I think it's about breaking that expectation as a mom, that we cannot all do it all, that we cannot be perfect. It's okay not to be perfect. It's okay if you feel like a failure. It's okay if, you're feeling frustrated and sometimes you just want to quit. And this all comes from just letting it out. And that is my hope, at least through Viva la Mami, that we get to share our and like share raw and true honest conversations about these lived experiences, because we cannot be perfect moms. I mean, it's okay not to be perfect.
Yeah. It's something that I am brought, like, it's brought to my attention every single day. I have a preteen, and every day she will tell me how I've failed, or, well, not failed, but like how I've messed up or said something that was rude or the tone wasn't right. And so then I think one thing that I've learned and have implemented, like you said, that like your grandmother never said that she loved your mom until she was 50 years old. One thing I do often is apologize. Uh, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
learning to get better. It's not easy because it was not modeled for me ever, still to this day. Um, but that's one thing. One thing, yes, every day. Um, and all I can do is just be thankful for the relationship that I have with my kids, that they feel safe to tell me, like, hey, that made me feel a certain
Yes.
way. And then I have the opportunity to say, okay, I'm sorry. I will, let's change this. Tell me
Right.
why that made you feel that way. Tell me how I can do better. Um, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yes, I
Parenting
love it.
is wild, and
Um,
especially when you're parenting and healing at the same time.
yes, yes. I never knew so much about myself. And granted, we have a 2-year-old. Even today, like I literally told my husband, I'm like, are we seriously fighting with a 2-year-old? And he won the battle.
Yeah.
This tiny little human, and now we're expecting another one, another boy, and we're really excited. And yeah, I just feel like it's going to be fun and interesting, just dealing with two,
Yeah.
not dealing, right, but just having two different personalities, two different individuals. So yeah, it'll be fun.
Yes, it is fun. Last question. What are your big goals for the year as far as what you have planned for Viva la Mami?
Yeah, so my big goals for this year is to build comunidad. And so I'm doing some research right now. I'm kind of in the preliminary stages of that, but I essentially want to create some sort of mentorship opportunity for new moms and experienced moms. And this is modeled after my previous work in higher education, where I chaired a committee of in my professional network, and I kind of coordinated mentees and mentors of like new professionals and experienced professionals, and I paired them up, and it was a 1 year kind of program. And that's something that I'm like, how can I bring this to mamas, right? And especially when it comes to Latina moms. Again, it's not about being exclusive, but in a way it's being intentional in creating programs like these because, yes, even though we have comadres, even though we have hermanas, cousins, grandparents, whatever it is, like there's nothing like special than meeting another person, an experienced mom or a new mom for that matter, and you get to know more about them and the way they parent and the way that they do about their day-to-day lives. So yeah, so I want this to be an educational experience, but also um, a very rewarding experience as well, so that moms wouldn't feel isolated in their journeys.
That's great. And where can people find your community, your share all your socials and your website?
Yes. So I can be found on Instagram, which is Viva la Mami. And I have my podcast as well. So you can follow me on whatever platform you listen to, but it is the Viva la Mami podcast. And then my website is vivalamami.com.
Perfect. My goodness. I'm sure we could like continue talking all day, but I am so thankful for your time and the wisdom and advice and encouragement that you shared. And I'm even more thankful that you are building this much needed space. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm glad it worked out. And I'm sure that we will connect soon, either online or in person. So, all right, I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
I just love when I can chat with someone so passionate about building a community because they saw a need for it in their own lives. And speaking of community, if you haven't joined yet, please join the Elevating la Cultura comunidad on Facebook, where we can continue the conversations we have on the podcast. And sometimes I go live spontaneously, so if you're wanting another way to connect with me and go deeper on the episodes and talks we have on the podcast, join the Facebook group. Okay, amigos. There'll be a new episode every Tuesday, so after you listen, feel free to take a screenshot, post on Instagram, and tag at Elevating la Cultura, or send me a DM. You can also comment on this YouTube video if you're watching online. I always like to hear from people and how they resonate with the stories that I share. So leave a review on Apple Podcasts so we can get more ears listening to these stories and we can continue elevating la cultura. All right, enjoy the rest of your day, afternoon, evening, whenever you're listening, y nos vemos next week. Bye.